Even though the Biden administration just fired several staffers who'd used marijuana and other drugs, the stigma surrounding pot seems to be at an all-time low. As you may know from firsthand experience, Massachusetts and several other states have recently legalized or decriminalized marijuana cultivation, use, and possession. Now there is a growing push to do the same for psilocybin, the psychoactive substance found in hallucinogenic mushrooms. Last year, voters in Oregon backed the legalization of psilocybin in controlled therapeutic settings. And this year in Massachusetts, the Cambridge and Somerville city councils passed resolutions aimed at reducing or eliminating the enforcement of anti-psilocybin laws. At the State House, meanwhile, Cambridge State Rep Mike Connolly is pushing for a task force that would explore the legalization of hallucinogenic plants statewide. But while proponents tout psilocybin's therapeutic upside, skeptics say there are some big questions that need to be answered first. Joining me to weigh the pros and cons are Dr. Jerry Rosenbaum, the director of Mass General Hospital's Center for Anxiety and Traumatic Stress Disorders and MGH's new Center for the Neuroscience of Psychedelics, and Dr. Bertha Madras, professor of psychobiology at Harvard University, director of McLean Hospital's Laboratory of Addiction Neurobiology, and former deputy drug czar in the White House's Office of National Drug Control Policy. Thank you both for being here. Jerry, let me start with you. Since you run the center at MGH, in layperson's terms, what is the neuroscience of psychedelics, and how can they be beneficial to the human mind?
Well, we, like many people, have been struck by what's really a tsunami of testimonials and some small studies that, particularly in patients who have not responded to traditional treatments, that there's something about what these substances do to the human brain that seems to allow capacity for change. So our interest in this area was pretty focused on trying to understand that. What exactly is going on in the brain and the nervous system. So our neuroscience project really spans everything from cells, brains in a dish, animal models, to studies of the human brain exposed to these substances. We don't see ourselves as part of the large movement of advocacy, although I think we take a more optimistic view about these substances than some do. But our focus is really on trying to fill a gap in what is known about what these agents do to the brain.
Can you describe some of the evidence that has accrued to show that they can be beneficial when it comes to reconfiguring the brain for people suffering from mental illness? Yeah. You mentioned a couple studies, just one of those, if you could describe it, or even a case study involving one person. Anything that speaks to what you're discussing would be great.
So it's a great question because the evidence base is not typically what physicians or the FDA would say has demonstrated efficacy. What you have is a lot of very impressive stories and small studies, most of them actually open studies. But the key thing in those is that they were mainly in people who had failed to respond to other treatments or had long-standing psychiatric suffering that resolved and that change seemed durable. So small studies might be 20 or 30 subjects open. There have been there are controlled studies going on. Psilocybin is in what we call phase 2B, an FDA approved clinical trial. And MDMA is in phase 3 for studying its efficacy in PTSD. But most of the evidence to date are in small trials by respectable investigators. But bear in mind that they're enthusiasts. There are people who believe strongly in these agents and populations very eager to try them. So while, again, we're optimistic and it's promising, there's a lot left to know.
Bertha, let me get you in here. My understanding is that you have some concerns about how increased use of psilocybin in therapeutic contexts might play out possible adverse effects. Can you describe those for me? What are the things that worry you as people start investigating the sort of questions that Jerry was talking about?
Well, I think there are 3 questions. I'd like to preface my comments by saying that Jerry's approach at the Mass General is exactly what I would want. No true scientist is against conducting good, solid research. It's the consequences and how the research is interpreted is the critical thing. And secondly, how solid is the evidence? So I have three questions. How solid is the evidence that has happened so far? We've had a very few limited studies. In 2020, we had 17 now, with a few focused on MDMA, on ecstasy. The vast majority are psilocybin because there's a feeling that it is one of the lesser of the problematic hallucinogens, and there's just a scattering of LSD studies. So my first question is, how good is the science? And I can get into the reasons why I'm a little bit concerned about the quality of the science. The second issue is that the way the science has been conducted, and Roland Griffiths, I think, has done a reasonably good job at Hopkins, but how it's been conducted is under the most rigorous conditions. They put patients in a living room, they coach them ahead of time, they stay with them for 8 hours, they have somebody holding their hand, they pick out 40 pieces of music that are going to resonate with that individual. And there's a coach with them at all times. So this is a protocol that is quite labor intensive. And the question is, how quickly is that going to be lost in the wash if there's a rush to judgment with regard to just incorporating it into practice? And my third concern is the reality of unintended consequences. We've seen a vast uptick in unintended consequences with respect to drugs that are psychoactive, that are scheduled by the Controlled Substances Act. And that's obviously the opioids crisis, which was catalyzed by prescription opioids, and the medical marijuana story, which devolved very rapidly into marijuana legalization. Once you place a label on a drug that it's a medicine and it's safe, then we are the Wild West of the world in terms of running amok with regard to not adhering to regulations. And our biggest problem also is generational forgetting. We have forgotten the lessons we learned with opioids, and we're probably going to forget the lessons we've learned with hallucinogens.
Let me, I guess, just continue down the road that you two have taken us down. There was a study that I was reading about before our conversation. It was, you two will know it, some of our viewers may, it was a JAMA psychiatry study of 24 people, so a fairly small group, with major depressive disorder. They had 2 psilocybin treatments and accompanying therapy, I think, conducted with the guardrails that you described, Bertha. And yes, more than half of them were in remission a month later, which is on the face of it, an incredibly impressive number. If I were struggling with major depressive disorder and couldn't get relief from other treatments, it would certainly make me want to try that. And yet, Bertha, as you point out, there does seem to be a risk, as there is this broader movement to maybe legalize these the way we legalize marijuana. I think we should probably stress that someone who is watching at home who has been feeling deeply depressed should not think, oh, the answer is taking some mushrooms, so I'll go out and try that. Is that fair?
That's fair, because the people who've been excluded from the clinical trials thus far are people with severe mental disorders. And
bipolar illness, schizophrenia are contraindications at this point to use.
Yes.
Although that's also not well studied.
Yeah. So what we're going to do is, as we did with opioids, generalize its use. In terms of opioids, it was all forms of pain, without any time limits, without any dose limits at the beginning. And we have a disaster, a crisis unprecedented in our history. And I am really concerned that unless the FDA, if they approve any of the hallucinogens, which is possible, unless they have rigorous controls in terms of training, in terms of the circumscribed settings for the patients, we're going to end up with another drug added to our problems.
And it's again probably worth highlighting, and Jerry, I'd love to get you to weigh in on this. Whereas people experiment with marijuana who might not have tried it before, now it's legal and you can go to a dispensary and give it a try and probably have a fairly mellow experience. Psilocybin's different. Is that a fair statement?
It can be. I mean, people are using it in all different ways, from microdosing, which some people endorse as having been very helpful, which is almost imperceptible in terms of the more dramatic experience that people can have with a full dose infusion, for example. So there's a whole range of experience with it. The part of what Bertha has said that I share is because I'm optimistic that there's a story here that will be helpful to many patients that we haven't been able to help before. Unsupervised use, untrained use, unregulated use will inevitably lead to some adverse consequences that may set us back for different reasons, but analogous to what happened in the 60s, for example. That there may be another tool in the toolkit that will allow us to treat some patients we haven't been able to treat. For someone who practices the way I do, which focuses on treatment-resistant patients, this is a very, very hopeful. And also,
proceed with caution.
Proceed with caution, and as substances, in terms of the potential harm to self and harm to others, they're not the worst things out there.
Okay. On that note, sounds like this is a story that will be playing out more. We've got to leave it there. Thank you both for being here. Jerry Rosenbaum, Bertha Madras, appreciate it.
Thank you.